Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, Gary shares his personal journey with just the difficulties that life can throw at you. And I am just so in awe of the vulnerability and the honesty that he brought to this conversation, and to see where he is today from where he started. It is just such a beautiful story that I hope all of y'all really enjoy. And additionally, I also was diagnosed recently with an autoimmune disease, so it was very personal for me to be editing this podcast and listening to it again and hearing just the positivity that he comes at life with. I hope to have the same joy and the same positivity that he holds on to dearly. So this is a really good episode that I think all of y'all are going to really enjoy. Tune in. Well, then I think a way to start would be, you were nominated for this podcast by Pam. Why do you think she nominated you?
Well, so Pam is, I believe, married to my friend Mike. And Mike was kind of one of these folks that when I was very young, he was kind of in a generation ahead of me. His band would play these local shows when I was like 13, 14. And so coming into that, I looked up to him. Kind of first time I met Pam, saw the band, liked it, and she was really into what we were my band was about. So.
Okay, I feel like you still haven't answered the question, though. To be frank, right? So she must see something that's inherently very strong about you, and in some way that you are standing against mainstream culture. So I want to push you a little bit even deeper. Like, why do you think she picked you?
Well, I would say the thing maybe that is a little unique about me is I'm probably one of the most positive people I know, with a lot of issues that would generally cause someone not to be positive. I have an autoimmune disorder, and that has been something probably from like when I was 25 on, caused a lot of things to happen in my life that, depending on how you were looking at it, you might feel like your life was stolen from you. Like between the ages of 20 and 25, I was working in a recording studio. By 25, I was running a mastering facility, making like $60 an hour. I was on like I owned it. I was on track to probably do that for the rest of my life. And then I started having these health issues, and I realized like stress, couldn't deal with it anymore. Like even the like slightest amount of the normal stuff you'd be doing running a business, couldn't deal with it. My health would get worse, I'd notice, when I'd get more things going on, and couldn't find a way around it. So I kind of had to give that up, and I had to, over the next, from when I was 25 to 40 now, so how many over years that is, I kind of had to figure out ways to re-examine my life, rebuild my life, try and get the pieces of it that I enjoy, but also respect my mental health and my body, and not really go over that. And I don't know, like now I'm like the happiest person I've ever been, and it's kind of nuts. I never really thought I would be as happy as I am now. I knew I wouldn't be like destroyed from the issues that I've had, but just in the past 5 or 6 years, like things have gotten drastically better. So
now I see why Pam nominated you. This is a story. You have a beautiful story to tell. Would you say it starts at 25? Is that where you want to start talking about more of your experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I was 25, I was married, mm-hmm. and I was in a relationship, and I had started finding out these health issues. Kind of got in the first part was I found I was allergic to all this crazy stuff. Like they tested me for 45 foods. I was allergic to 43.
Oh no.
Yeah, like low level allergies. Some of them were high level. There was only probably like 5 or 6 like high level allergies, but it was enough to the point where like my immune system, eating a normal diet, I was just getting destroyed, But yeah, I'd been kind of married and been in this relationship for about 6 or 7 years, and things were just falling apart. I was really angry. Like, I was not dealing with the stuff that I had in my life. I grew up with like physical abuse, that kind of thing, from my dad. And I'd kind of internalized it. I'd become physically abusive too, and verbally abusive and all that. So sitting there at 25, kind of having this whole thing kind of like in the period of like 6 or 7 months, I decided to close down my studio, realized I couldn't really do what I was planning to do for the last 5 or 6 years, and realized that I was abusive and this relationship wasn't working. And it was a crazy, crazy place to be. But kind of the only way I got through it was my ego was so broken by just so many of the different things. And I don't mean that in like an egotistical way, but I mean that in, I think a lot of people we all have a hard time seeing the reality about ourselves because we'll kind of cling to like our rationalizations because our whole existence depends on it, you know? And when everything's already broken, it's a lot easier to just accept, like if you've already accepted, like I've got to change, and like you don't really feel any clinging to any of the stuff that you have about you that you do feel good about, it's a lot easier to like accept things and really just be like, look, I don't know what I'm doing at all with my life. You know, like everything I thought was up isn't, you know, it wasn't. And it's not, and when you're being like physically abusive or something like that, it's not like you feel like, it's not like you think you're doing something right. Like, you know, it's wrong. But what you don't realize is like people will get these rationalizations of like, oh, well, I'm angry, and so this is why I'm acting this way, right? Mm-hmm. They don't see themselves as being in the continuum of like an abusive like cycle, right? Like where they're seeing just even the language they use. Like you'll hear a lot of like, well, you made me angry. Like a lot of just non-acceptance of their own part and what happens when you get angry. That, you know, yeah, you can be angry. Like there's nothing wrong with being angry. Anger is a secondhand emotion, but you know, when it's in your mind that like the obvious solution is to become violent or to scream or to yell or to call names, you know. And that was the other thing too. I didn't really understand the verbal component of that. You know, like I read this book called On Killing. And it's this book by this military guy that kind of like went through like the psychology of how humans are able to do kind of horrible things to each other. And humans always try to like isolate themselves from the bad they are doing. Sometimes they do it by using dehumanizing terms. So like racists will use, you know, racial slurs and this kind of thing. It creates a distance. If you're a bomber pilot, you have like physical distance between you and, you know, your victim. You're like 30,000 feet above them or something. But, you know, using like misogynistic words towards like your partner or something like that, or yeah, I mean that kind of like distance stuff, it ends up in a thing where you're in a relationship and you're not arguing with somebody you love. You're arguing with this person that you've kind of dehumanized in this way. From that point, I kind of had to reevaluate everything and started kind of figuring out what worked with my life and what kind of life did I really want to live. And, you know, fast forward, I had a kid and I was already in a pretty good spot with my life, but then that kind of changed everything else too. It was probably the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. But, and I was worried a little bit, you know, coming from the stuff I've had to deal with my health and all that about being a parent. But I realized that if I could put the kid first always and kind of approach life like that, then I'd be good. And it's been awesome. So
there is a lot there to talk about. Like,
yeah.
This is a deep story. Okay. First, thank you for sharing everything that you're sharing. This is all extremely personal information, and I appreciate your vulnerability in telling all of this to me and all of the listeners that, you know, are hearing your story for the first time. I think this is a very powerful narrative, this concept of abuse that you had enacted upon you as a child in your home, to being an abuser yourself, and then to recognize that and change it and name it. That's huge. So many people never make it to that step of getting out of
No.
the cycle of trauma that they're reenacting from their own experience. And so I want to ask you more about that. That's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a. I think it might be easier for me to accept because having kind of negative narratives in my life for so long
Mm-hmm.
and having kind of crazy stuff happen to me at earlier ages, I know folks that are like scared to go to a therapist. And to me, I'm just like, why? Like, you can only get better. You know what I mean? But I think they're like kind of lucky in that they maybe feel better in the get-go and they haven't really kind of opened some of that stuff up. And so they're afraid that they will and it'll be worse. But kind of my thing is I've always been like coming from a very realistic, after a certain point, I've been used to dealing with stuff. And so the thought, like I kind of look at it as like, being scared to go get a scan to see if you have cancer. It's like, if you have cancer, the scan's not going to cause it to have more. Like, you're just going to know. And I'm kind of the thing of like, dude, put it on the table. Let me figure out, because this is all I have to work with. And like the life of people around me is not going to be better if I ignore things. And I think that's kind of like our ultimate goal as human beings is to try and be good folks to ourselves and the people around us. Like, I think that is our only responsibility as human beings, is like our own, well, not only responsibility, but that is our main job, is to be decent and helpful and whatever to the folks in our world.
It's interesting you say this because I resonate with this a lot. I've always been this similar kind of person of, if there's a fire, face it head on. We'll decide how to move from that. We can't run away from that. But like, even that, I don't know how I got here. And I'm curious if you know how you got there, of just like not running away from your problems.
I think it's because I noticed that, like, I would get bullied a lot when I was a kid. And then like kind of later in life, like I was never one of those people that was able to like ask other people for help. Like, I would just teach myself how to fix it. And I think that just came from kind of the way I grew up. Like, I was an older brother, but it was kind of like when I was like 7, like my guitar stopped working and I had to like take it apart and figure out how to fix it. And I didn't have like a soldering iron or anything like that. So I like taped the wires back together, I just realized though that when things got worse, like when crises did happen, if I didn't have all this other stuff kind of in line, then it all snowballed. So like kind of all through my life, I've been, even when I was being like shitty and abusive, like in other areas, I was trying to always deal with as much as I could. Like, actually try and figure it out as much as I could, because that way, when the worst does happen, it doesn't destroy me. I can kind of get through it, and my life has kind of just been a continuation of that trajectory, with lots and lots of figuring things out. I mean, I've been pretty much in therapy consistently since 2005, 2004.
Where is that in your timeline of age?
So I was born in 1979, so 2005 I would have been 26.
Okay, so right after you were figuring out your health stuff.
Yeah. So, and it was crazy because I didn't, like, when I first met some of my friends, and like when I was like friends that I've had for many years, I didn't really realize that I'd kind of had an abusive childhood. Because I'd see stuff on TV and be like, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like, you can deal with it. And that was kind of a weird thing to like meet folks and them being like, dude, you're dealing with a lot. I was like, oh, really? That makes life make a lot more sense, because it just seemed like improbably hard.
If you're willing, would you be open to sharing more about that experience and that time in your life?
Yeah, sure. Like, what in particular?
Your childhood. I mean, even just, especially that narrative right there, right? Someone allowed you to see what you're holding was so much. How many people listening might learn from your experience that they had a troubling childhood too? I don't know what your story is, but that's a big switch that could help someone else.
Yeah. I mean, I did a little bit of radical mental health support later in life. And I've talked to people that had some crazy fucking childhoods. I did not have a crazy childhood. I just had a parent that, well, I had two parents. I had my mom, who I love, and my dad, who I do love. But my dad, for whatever reasons, didn't really handle things well. And you learn to compartmentalize things. Like I really, and then I kind of just spent the rest of my life learning, or not the rest of my life, but the rest of my childhood and a good bit of my life, learning how to satiate abusive people. Like learning how to like, oh, you're going to be abusive right now? Let me calm you down. Let me do whatever I need to do so that you don't do that anymore. Just trying to make it from point A to point B with the least amount of abuse. And just never really thinking of it in that higher frame of, oh, like, this isn't right. Like, that just seems way too theoretical and way too whatever at that point in time. Like, as an 8-year-old, like, all you're concerned with is, like, how can we make it through the rest of this beach trip with that not happening again? And I never, like, blamed myself for it, even though my dad would literally blame me. Mainly because I could see that, you know, like, it was just very obvious. Like, for some reason, I could see that it was his problem. I know some kids blame themselves for that. I never did that, but I did end up coming out of it thinking that I was an idiot, like out of my childhood. Like I remember when they did like in high school, that valuation of like what kind of job you should get. And they were like, oh, you should be a janitorial engineer. Yeah. Like 6 years later, I'm running my own mastering studio, you know, like kind of from that, I was just very alienated. I think I probably also was autistic. I didn't have any clue. Like, so I was born in 1979. So when I was like 10, it was 1989. They didn't really have autism as like something that was like really diagnosed, except in like pretty extreme conditions. I don't even think the diagnosis actually existed until the late 80s, I think. Maybe it was later than that. But when my daughter was born, a couple years after that, we found out that they were on the spectrum. And so I started reading about it, and I realized that a lot of the things that I thought were just weird, quirky me was probably me being kind of on the higher functioning side of autism. So I think that probably contributed a little bit to some of the awkwardness I felt kind of growing up. But then, you know, it kind of as I aligned with like socially, like I would get bullied, you know, through school. And it wasn't until I met my friend, this guy Patrick, who I ended up starting my first band with, that I was able to actually feel like I had a value, I guess, to like other people.
That's incredibly sad.
Yeah.
You know, like wow, that's the first time that you felt like you had value as a human being in your life?
Yeah. And I kind of like discovered punk rock maybe like a year after that. And then all of a sudden I went from like having no value to, you know, playing shows and like people being interested in what I had to say. Like I remember like when I was like 14, we started doing interviews and stuff like that. And like I'd be quoted in a newspaper. It was nuts. It felt like winning the lottery, you know? The only other time it's ever felt like that in my life was when I had my daughter. That becoming a dad felt like winning a lottery to me.
So I'm thinking in long term of your story and trajectory. At that point, 14, you're starting to feel the value, but you're still living under, if your parents were together, a dangerous situation, especially for you as you're growing older and, you know, becoming a man at that time, and your father is abusive. That becomes increasingly more dangerous.
Yeah. And, you know, it got to the point where like I'd started fighting back. Like around like 13 or 14. And it would get into weird stuff where like, you know, he'd hit my mom, police would get called because I hit him. Then the police would show up and my mom kind of doing the same thing I did in the back of the car, not, you know, let's just contain this abusive person, wouldn't want to press charges. And so I'd end up getting charged with stuff. After a certain point, I ended up leaving, like right when I was like 17. I ended up getting something in high school where they actually like let me out early if I like did some like GED class. And so they just let me leave at a certain point and moved out on my own. And yeah.
Yeah, what was that like? I mean, now
What?
that time, now you move out. These are big life changes that I can't even begin to imagine what it was like to walk through your shoes of living that experience. And now, did your parents stay together and you're leaving your mom behind, but equally leaving for your safety? And you just graduated high school? Like, wow, that's a lot.
Well, and there was another, so like probably right before that, my friend Patrick, the guy I'd kind of started the band with and all that, he ends up getting in a car accident and getting killed.
Oh my God.
So once that happened, my kind of world was upside down. And I think I moved out maybe a year after that. But yeah, then I just kind of, I don't know, like started trying to figure stuff out. And then I was kind of like always just trying to keep things together from the second I got out until, I find myself kind of in this long-term relationship with this person, when I'm in my 20s, then I'm like building this studio. I never really got a chance to like slow down and really think about anything till like I was like 26.
Right.
But then by that time my health was going nuts. So, like my life has just been a series of crazy things, and probably most people's lives are, like I know folks that have had it way worse than me, but like I understand, like I've just met a lot of folks and kind of realized at a certain point that you can't really grade suffering. It's on your own scale, so like because it depends on your ability to deal with it. So like, this problem that might be huge for someone else, it might not be a big deal for you. And this problem that might be not a big deal for someone else, it might be huge for you. It really has to do with experience. And I realized kind of that, like, there were certain parts of my life where I would get jealous at like people having to deal with like maybe less than I have to deal with. But I realized that like that's what people should be dealing with, is that less amount. Like I shouldn't be angry that they're not dealing with more so that I feel whatever, you know what I mean? Like, and it's kind of like come forth being a parent where if I'm doing my job well, then my kid is going to complain about the most uselessly like not important things, and so, I'll be sitting there being like, wow, you're really screaming about this right now, thinking back to like what I had to deal with. But it's like, obviously, like I would never want them to ever deal with anything that I had to deal with. So it's you just kind of laugh and you're like, well, I guess this is the odd fruit of doing something slightly right. So
Exactly. I think what's interesting though is sometimes people, and myself included in this, tend to turn that perspective inward and then say what happened to me wasn't that bad. And in doing so, then invalidate their whole experience. So I wonder, have you ever struggled with that in this time? And I would imagine, based on the fact that Patrick was so key in opening that up to you.
No, I've always kind of like had that understanding that like if something bothers you, it bothers you.
Mm.
Like you should never fault yourself for being bothered by something.
Yeah.
You can fault yourself for how you deal with it. You can fault because that's according to your own thing. I mean, like one of the hard things I had to deal with when I realized I was being abusive is that wasn't who I thought I was in my head.
Mm.
And it also wasn't what I wanted to be. And so I was lucky in that, like, my mom is an amazing person. Like a really amazing person. Because of my mom, I've always had this very positive idea of what are the possibilities in life.
Mm-hmm.
I think, because I've had it from such a young age. So like when I'd see things, I don't know, like I could always kind of like tell they were wrong. Even when I was being abusive myself, I knew it was wrong. I think the thing that limited me was that I thought it was my own, like for many years, I thought it was, well, I have my dad's anger. I would write off a lot of personal responsibility by being like, well, I've got my dad's temper. I've got this and that's genetic, and it wasn't until I realized that, like, and I can't remember, maybe it's from my therapist, I don't know. I think it was from my therapist. She kind of like walked me through, and I was able to see that second to slow my brain down enough to see that second where that anger happens and then it turns to you acting. And once I was able to kind of just take a second and think, it was like the key for me, like being able to like control myself, basically, you know?
It's like the definition of mindfulness, right? Like,
Right. You're right.
I feel anger, but I am not my emotions, nor do I have to act out on these emotions, and I can let them pass.
Right. And that's nuts as a parent when like my kid is 8 now and you're seeing them learn how to deal with this stuff and you're just like, oh God, like, because they have no like control, you know, like they're so raw. They say kids are so honest. They are, but it's because they haven't learned how to control themselves also, you know? So.
But yeah, there's definitely a lot to learn from them. And we always talk about our inner child, right? And I think that's a key to finding how you move through these things. I want to ask you too, those first moments of learning to check in with yourself, could you talk more about the actual change process? Because that doesn't, right? You don't just like stop being abusive one day and heal. It's such a journey. And if you could just elucidate more of that, I'd love to hear.
Well, okay, so you know, the way I approached that was like, you know how like sex offenders are like looked at in movies where like, oh, you're going to get like, there'll always be that narrative of like the sex offender who realizes that he's like just this horrible sex offender and he just wants to avoid any whatever. There's no real narratives about people that realize they're abusive, right?
Yep.
So the kind of in my mind thing was I was just like, okay, well, I'm a fucking damaged good. And I'm just going to never be in a relationship with anyone that I care about ever the fuck again. And so I did that for about 4 years. Like, I think I kind of like lightly dated some people, but anytime a relationship would come up or anything like that, like I would not really want to get into it. I'd be scared because I didn't want to hurt anybody. And I'd rather be alone for the rest of my life than ever hurt somebody out of my control, you know? Because I didn't know if it was like, is it really just me choosing to not do this? Because if that is, that seems a little too simple. And why would there be abusive people?
Yeah.
You know? And so I was like, maybe it's more hardwired. So I was like scared. I'd get into these relationships and I'd be like scared. Like, oh God, we're going to get in a fight and something's going to switch in like my reptilian brain and I'm going to be this horrible person. And it took many years, but it never fucking happened. Once I learned how to like, just take a second, like I never found myself like, oh my, like I'm gonna explode. Like I just never, because the whole thing is once that happened, then it happened in every other process. So like when someone was arguing with me, I would just try to stay present with like, I love this person. Like I'm not gonna call them a name, you know. And that's the thing is I think a lot of folks don't really understand kind of how abuse works, but like for it to get to one side, like to get to physical, I guarantee you're also going to find folks and they're doing all this verbal stuff and they might think in their head that like, well, I'm cussing so I don't get angry or something, or I'm trying to get rid of my anger. But what you're actually doing is like, you're dehumanizing this other person. You're making it easier for you to hurt them and you don't even realize it. So once I kind of learned that, I applied it to most every part of my life. And it ended up making me feel a lot more empowered in my personal life, like not in relationships because I was basically just avoiding them, but like in terms of like, okay, a friend said something, it upset me. And I've also kind of like always had chronic depression. So like right there, I could be like, oh, well, maybe I'm worthless, or maybe it's because I'm worthless. I could start kind of like intercepting that process too. So it not only worked just for getting around anger, but also like self-destructive, like shitty thoughts, you know?
Right. Exactly. Because if you were thinking about, I'm genetically predispositioned to be an abuser. Oh, I'm depressed. I am predisposed to be this. And it's like, it's that same change there of recognizing your autonomy in each of these moments.
Yeah. And also your personal responsibility. Yeah. I mean, because that's what the big thing is in those things is like autonomy comes with responsibility, right? You know, it's kind of like this catch-22, I think, that a lot of folks might feel like they're in when they're in a situation like that where they don't really have the tools maybe to kind of pull apart what's actually happening. And it's crazy too when you're in a relationship because like things get crazy, you know, like you're in an argument and like you can't even remember what you're arguing about 20 minutes into it. So like pulling apart, like, what the hell just happened? Like, it's almost impossible, you know? So like the way I had to do it was kind of to just do these kind of like crazy examinations with my therapist of like going through things, and she just happened to be really good at doing it, and I was able to kind of like see like, oh, that's that second, that right there, that's where I need to not react, to think instead, to realize what's happening. And I'd also kind of gotten into Buddhism and reading about that, and that's another thing too of like, you know, talking about mindfulness, like it's a very empowering thing to hear that the Dalai Lama gets angry, right? Because he's a person. Of course he gets angry. But you don't take it out on people, you know? And getting angry is not wrong. Like we're hurt because we're fixed. We're fixed in this body. We have fixed egos, fixed positions of these kind of things. Anytime you're fixed like that, you're going to hurt because things are going to collide against you and against your expectation of what's happening. If you can just be a little more fluid and understanding in terms of like, you know, okay, maybe that person's having a bad day. I just generally try to have empathy for folks now, especially coming from where I've come from. I'm not in a position to judge anybody on anything.
Right.
And I also realize life is cyclic, you know, like life's kind of like chapters and stuff. So like for these years, you might be just a jerk, but you might be a really helpful person in the next 6 or whatever, you know. I try to be hopeful like that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really hard when we live in this world. And I think you mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation of we live in these narratives and these stories to make sense of everything that happens to us. But I always, and this is me personally thinking about my experience with mindfulness and a lot of what you're talking about, is I try to tell myself every single day I can choose how I want to live out this life. Every single moment I can ask, is this really what I want? And if it's not, I can make a drastic 180 at any time. But it's like doing so requires you to let go of the narrative of like, this is who I am, this is who this person is, and all these other things that allow us to find like stability and grounding in our existence. But like, if you let that go and recognize that like each moment someone can change, each moment I can change, the world can change, and then you find freedom to move through it. But then you have to let go of the narrative. And it's like, damn, they're like really playing against each other. The stability of safety versus like living into the unknown.
Yeah, like I kind of like use this metaphor a lot of like ice and water, right? When something is ice, you can chip it, right? But you can't chip water. If you take a hammer and put it into water, you know, whatever, it just moves around it. And that's kind of the thought I have about like our egos and our expectations and stuff in life. It's like learning to not be so tied. And this goes with, this is a very helpful lesson for anyone that has anger problems. I mean, it was a big thing for me is like when I realized that a lot of my upsetness was coming from what my expectations of the situation were. I think the saddest thing ever is when you have folks that can't appreciate the beauty of the craziness of life. Like when life says, oh, you want to do that? You're not doing that. You're doing this. And all you can do is react in this hurt way to what you thought was going to happen. And now you're completely oblivious to what is happening. And when you realize that like that happens all the time, you realize that a lot of the perception we have in those times is that we are being upset by life rather than being like, okay, rather than reacting with what is actually presently occurring. You know, my therapist said something to me one time. She was like, I was married twice in my life, and my second partner, we had our daughter, and we got divorced. And when I got divorced, my therapist told me, you need to think about what kind of legacy you want to set for your daughter. And I was like, what do you mean? Like when I'm dead or something? And they're like, no. So like, if you're like a family that hugs, like, you know, some families are huggy or some talk a lot about things or she was like, you can just do that. Like if you want to have that family, it's just you. So you don't need to get a partner on board. Like right now, you can just start doing that. So like if you're the family that just goes on walks and finds Pokemon, like you can do that. And I was just like, whoa, I actually can do that. Like I don't have to convince. And the thing is, so like I realized like, whoa, I can just kind of set the own culture here. And, that was a kind of empowering thing for me because it came at a time in my life where I was actually more cognizant of, like, I feel like I own 100% of my behaviors now. Like if I do something, I probably decided to do it, like I rarely find myself, knock on wood, I never find myself doing something I don't want to do. I never find myself getting more upset about something more than I want to, or reacting in a shitty way. And I think it's really just because I've had a lot of practice. Because parenting, like, you're just under the gun all the time, and you don't want to hurt your kids' feelings or anything like that. But then also just having to deal with the health stuff. Like in 2019, they kind of found out that I had a autoimmune disorder, because they were wondering, like, what's all these health issues that you're having? Like they thought I was having this kind of underlying autoimmune disorder, and I was worn down. I ended up having pneumonia and basically being in the hospital for a month, almost dying, being on like the septic scale. I'd stopped responding to all oral antibiotics, and so they put me in with a team, and they were just going through everything. They were like, what they ended up finding out was that I have this weird thing that allows me to not keep certain antibodies. So like the antibodies for the bacteria that usually cause pneumonia, my body just doesn't retain them. I thought I might die. I also thought that I might just not be able to be to co-parent at all. I didn't really know where my health was going to be. And I had to kind of sit there and be like, you know what? I had to give up my studio because of my health. I had to give up going to college later in life because of my health. What if I have to give up co-parenting? And it was like the worst thought, because when I became a dad, it was like winning the lottery. It was like, oh my God, the best thing ever. But, even in that was probably the hardest realization I ever had to try and have. Even in that, I knew, like, well, dude, I'd rather be 20% parent with my kid than 0, so like just focus on like the good side of it, but like having, especially those kind of health issues where like you're looking at that and like mortality and all this kind of thing, it kind of focuses you, number one, to see the good in it also, but then also coming with, someone that has chronic depression, you also realize that if you allow yourself to get into a certain point, it's not going to be good. And so like I have a responsibility to a lot of people around me to not go there. And it's like I can always see my depression. It's like a little puddle off to the side of me. And I know exactly what I could do to jump in there and just swim in it for a bit. But I just don't. I mean, I literally visualize it just kind of like as this puddle in asphalt, like on the street or something. And it's just this kind of like bunch of negative thoughts. But it's like a snowball thing. Like once you get into it, you're just going to end up at the end of this cycle of feelings and thoughts that are going to conclude with your brain telling you and confirming every worst thing about you. And it's all based on like speculation. It's all evaluations of past things. There's not really any absolute facts in it, so it's like, well, you might have dropped this, but like your rationalization is because you suck, and like not because of like you're fallible and a human, It's just kind of, catering into the worst conclusions possible on every single thing. So, I do my best to avoid that, while just kind of also, and I think people confuse jumping into that puddle sometimes with letting them feel hurt. Like, because we have to feel emotion. Like sometimes we have to stop what we're doing and really just be like I had a breakup,
Gary, you're an amazing person.
Oh, thank
Your
you.
emotional maturity and intelligence is beautiful. What you're saying, all these things of, where you've been, who you are now, and the ability to control your emotions and see them and keep this mindfulness is an immense, immense strength that so many people don't ever tap into, or if they do, after many, many years of life and struggle. So I'm just in awe of the person that you are and everything that you're telling us today.
Well, thanks. I mean, I've had a lot of practice. I mean, like it's like a trifecta of like my childhood and then just depression and then the health issues and then throwing the kind of parenting. But all these things have given me amazing opportunities. I mean, it's kind of silly or whatever, but in Buddhism, they're like, dealing with your enemies is a time to practice. dealing with hardship, dealing with things that you're not ready for or maybe that you're not open for is a time to practice. And once you get in there, like, you can realize that, like, sometimes you're reacting poorly because, you know, it's something you need to learn about. Because, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I just don't want to suffer, and I don't want other people to suffer. And that's kind of been the motivation for any bit of thought that I've put into trying to figure anything out, is that, you know, it's like that Hippocratic oath of, like, first do no harm. And I would like to be a functional member of society. And if I'm going to interact with people, I don't want to be, like, being shitty to them.
And you also want to interact with yourself kindly. Sometimes we forget
Right.
how big of a part of that equation is that, like, learning how to interact well with other people, I believe strongly takes interacting with yourself internally so much better. And this work is so difficult. It is not fun. I never want to call any of this work fun. It's hard and difficult, and you have to, like, open yourself up and be sensitive to asking, where is this coming from? And when you find out what that is, holding the compassion for yourself to actually learn from it and not have shame. And that is not fun, but the rewards are so great. So great.
And in my experience, the work has been kind of easy. It's that the realizations are hard, right? Realizing why you're hurting about something, that, you know, it's not simple, because the hard part is coming to terms with, why does this thing hurt you so bad? Why did this thing upset you so bad? And it usually has to do with you accepting loss of something.
Yeah, loss of an expectation for your life, a loss of a person that you hoped would be something, our parents, lovers, children, so many different things. And again, it's this narrative of we want the world to be what is understandable and easy, and it frequently defies that desire. It gives us complexity, and it gives us the gray, and it gives us chaos and all these things. And so I feel like you are just such a bright example of learning to surrender to that and then move through it. That's beautiful.
Well, it's, you know, it's also part of music. Like, if I write songs all by myself, it's just my song, and it's to the extent of my imagination and understanding. But when I bring him into a band, and he might mishear it, or he might interpret it differently, there's some folks that can't handle that. They're going to walk in there and be like, no, I need this exactly like that. But what I realized was, it makes it richer. It makes the end result richer. Like, mishearing what I said, or like you taking it a completely different way, then throwing it back at me like this, and then me doing that too. Like, we end up with these ideas that are way more complex than just what any one of us can bring.
Yes, exactly. And I think what's been interesting as I've started editing this podcast is I was watching a lot of the sound waves when you're recording, and just these voices. And so as you're talking about this, I'm also thinking about some things that I've been thinking independently on my own that really resonate. And I love these moments where we can bring thoughts together. So I was thinking a lot about that and just these concepts of life. And yeah, what is stagnant? I consider myself a very happy person. I have anxiety, but I consider myself happy. But then there are days where sometimes I'm just not happy. And I just got so frustrated. I was like, why? Like, why? Like, why am I here today? But it really is this movement of up and downs, and that is super normal. And it's just catching those slight slopes and not riding it deeper into a state of depression and worry. And I think what freaks me out as someone entering the field of psychology and working with all these sorts of things is that the concept of depression and these different mental problems, it's a very disease state model where, like, you have depression. This is who you are, and it defines you. And in my opinion, I think it keeps you stagnant in that spot and not recognizing that it is so dynamic. Some days you might feel a little bit better. And if you learn to ride that upward momentum, you can get out of it. But if you feel like it's a static thing and it defines who I am, and it defines every day that I look at the world through that lens, it's going to be so hard to get out of that.
Yeah, and that's I've never been like a person that's like really into like labels. Having that idea of like, okay, if I do have depression, I know, look, it's like I have this other thing called hyperglycemia where like if I eat like starches, they'll, convert to sugar within like 2 hours. So like I can't eat the way other people eat. I just have to work with that calculus, And so kind of the same thing with dealing with depression is like, I shouldn't avoid possibly depressive things like getting in a relationship or something, but you just know when you get into these certain areas, like you're not going to have a harder time with it. Possibly. You just have to do things differently. I don't view it as a limit. I view it as like a fact of your life kind of, and, it's also a humbling thing when you hit limits where like you want to do more and still kind of like not feel bad about yourself, because it's like, like all I'm really accountable for is how I react to the life around me, and part of that is also when you react badly, not just giving up. A lot of the success of that depends on how you handle failing. And that's a good thing that I'm really good at is failing. Like I've been failing for so long that I just don't even I just expect it.
Oh yeah, someone says you're a failure. You're like, no, I failed. I am not a failure. That label is not moving forward with me. And I think that's what makes you an incredibly strong person. And even as the host of this, I'm like thinking to myself, like, have I asked him about the joy? He said he's a very happy person, all these other things, but I think the joy comes in the acknowledgement of everything that we just talked about. That's where the joy just starts to sprout out, because then when things happen that are beautiful in your life, you're incredibly thankful for them, and you can see it because you're not so focused on controlling all the other aspects of chaos. And then this happiness just starts to elude from you. And
a big thing that brings me joy is just being able to be a father. And that joy feels like, it's just struggles. It's just getting through the day. It's just like, oh my God, I was able to get the dishes done. I was able to make sure that they did school today. I was able to, not flip out, handle it all well, end it with a smile. Also, you have to do horrible things. You have to punish kids and you have to parent them and like discipline them. And, that can feel really rough sometimes. Even up until like maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I think it might've been more because of the relationship I was in, but like probably like 4 years ago, I was like horribly depressed and I was just having a bunch of health issues and, they're kind of all accumulating on top of each other. But the thing I didn't realize was I was in a relationship where like just personality wise, we were like opposite sides of the coin. And so it would just take every bit of me to get out of like the day, like to get through the day. And I don't know, like once that kind of came off, that whole relationship, I realized, I don't know, it was kind of like running a marathon with like a 100-pound backpack and then taking it off. And I was like, oh, wow. And so for like the last 2 years, I've just been like a lot happier. I think also it was kind of, you're just kind of, I wasn't able to see a lot of the things in myself that had kind of developed because we were in a relationship for like 8 years. I wasn't able to see that because it's so hard to see yourself when you're in a live-in relationship with somebody. Like just from the live-in part, like even just having a roommate, like it's hard to see where like your actual natural cycles are.
I've been equating it a lot to almost kind of like a pool, right? Like an enclosed pool of water. And you naturally have your own rhythm, movement to that water, right? But then when you come in and live in very close proximity to another person's waves and energy, just think about that small pool that gets a little bit of rock and then another rock and it builds on each other. But when you take a step out from that situation and spend alone time, the waters really settle and you can kind of look actually in that clear water and see your reflection. And that's a lot of Buddhist mindfulness, right? I mean, that's where I'm getting this metaphor from, probably, totally. Because I read Thich Nhat Hanh, which talked about that. They talk about the fact that like our thoughts are like this river, and only when we can calm, we can see our reflection in it and actually see who we are. And I think that requires alone time. And I think that's what makes these relationships with humans so hard. We have such energy that we do vibe off of each other. And I think I'm kind of like you in that same way of I believe in science. So I don't know how much I want to believe in energy, but we know mirror neurons work where when we're with other humans, we tend to like pick up their energy and it actually translates in how we move our body, how we feel different emotions. And that's science. Like that's known. And so it's like, yeah, these relationships, these friendships, all of these dynamics are really changing yourself as well. And it takes time to kind of find who you are. And I could imagine that's probably a lot of what you found in this alone time of listening to yourself again.
Yeah, totally. And it was crazy because I'd never really been alone. Out of my whole life, I've lived alone for 9, 10, 11, 12 months. And then half the time I've got my daughter here, so is it really alone? But it's illuminating.
Oh yeah, I think Virginia Woolf was onto something when she wrote about the importance of having a room of one's own to become your own person. And so yeah, I live alone too, and I think it's been the key to a lot of learning about myself.
I was scared of it at first, and it was a little weird at first, like the first month or two. I was scared as being someone with depression. You know, it's like one of those life fact things. Like there's certain things I need to do. I was worried that like not having someone to kind of just impose another reality. I was worried that, I mean, because it all happens to all of us at some level, just with, I think that's a lot of what we see with just kind of like people getting weird political beliefs in their 40s or 50s. Is they don't kind of have like these regular checks. And, so I was a little worried about that, but with the balance of my daughter, it actually ends up working out great. Because it's like I have them on this rotating schedule that gives me a break, which is crazy as a parent to ever get a break. Like I have days where like they're not here, and then they're on, and then it's like days off, and it's amazing. It's an amazing thing, and I think it works out great for them because they kind of get the best of both me and their mom.
Exactly. I think. Well, then I have a question for you, a little bit of a segment, but also because it's something I ask everyone on this show. What is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal? And I think the reason why I was cued into this is because I think parenting teams, in my opinion, need to be more normalized as a beautiful thing. And that does do exactly what you're saying of bringing out the best of both parent that leads that child through their development. So that doesn't have to be your thing, but it is something I do ask everyone on the show.
I would think realizing that your brain will do everything it can to make you feel like crap. For certain types of people, maybe. But it's almost every person I've ever interacted with. If your brain can take that the wrong way, it fucking will. One of the things that I'm so thankful for being in therapy for so long is being able to identify these personal issues that I have, to realize where my brain's more gonna do it, you know, and kind of so that you can disregard that narrative. You can realize, yeah, that's probably just because my brain's an asshole and wants me to, you know. And it's weird because also when you start working on these things and you get better with it, your brain actually kind of ramps it up. Your brain actually kind of intensifies it, but you get better at kind of just flipping it away.
Exactly.
But it starts to almost get angry at you of like, you're not paying attention to me.
Let me scream louder. Yeah. Dang. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I would say a lot of people are probably in that boat as well. And I think that's why I'm so incredibly thankful for people like you who are willing to come on this show and be vulnerable. And I think that's the beauty of the music you were talking about that you were making, of being vulnerable, of this is where I am in my life. And I hope that that's what this show is, of just normalizing so many of these things, to recognize that we're all in this boat together and our brains are always trying to find, yes, the worst way to look at this, and having mirrors and other people that see you change that narrative, like your therapist who heard your inner dialogue and gave you a new perspective. And here, as we collaborate together to create this conversation, and then all the listeners who hear from this, and I feel like hopefully find a home in the story that you've shared today. Yeah,
I mean, it's been, there's this idea of like truth that we have kind of about ourselves, about our own narrative. You know, probably the worst feeling ever you can have in your life is when you realize that, or at least for me, it's been when I realized that what I thought was true wasn't. Like when you find out that like all your friends think you're an idiot or something, you know, like in like third grade or something, or like that you're actually really bad at this, or that you've been a part of an abusive cycle, that everything you've thought, you know, like the whole way I found out that I was abusive versus just being shitty and abusive was my ex-wife had mailed or emailed me like this list of abusive behaviors when we had split up. But like reading it, it was enough for me to realize like, oh, that's not just me with a temper. That's like a fucking cycle. That's like that's a role that I'm part of. Having little moments where like you get outside your truth just for a second to like be able to be like, whoa, you know, maybe I know it's weird. We have to walk this life being confident in the things we do know, but simultaneously being confident that we're also going to be fucking wrong, but being humble enough to correct and hopefully not alienate or hurt anybody so bad in the process.
I think that is life. That is life right there. And I think the more people that learn to work in that gray space, the more freedom and the more joy that they're going to find, just like you, despite whatever history of events. I think that lesson is applicable to all of humanity.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, you've shared such a beautiful story today, and I'm so, so thankful for you.
Well, thank you for having me on. Thank you so much.
Is there anywhere that you could plug for people who want to find your stuff, your music?
I sing in a band called 92FU, just 92FU. Playing another band called $5 Fine. That was the band with my friend Patrick. And then I have my own solo stuff. It's just under Gary Lama. And I do a podcast called Various Things Podcast. But if you're not from Richmond, I don't know if it'd be viable.
Well, yeah, I will put links below so that people can find your music, and I'll put some links so they can just click it below.
Thank you so much for having me. It's cool to actually do.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, then subscribe for new episodes released every Wednesday, and follow us on Instagram at Modern Anarchy Podcast, where we open up a dialogue about all of these topics. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. And a special thanks to one of my favorite artists, Your Smith, for the intro and outro song to this show.